Hey top percenters, fairies are a thing. Big basics are a thing. Let's look at Fairy Big Basics. Or, to give it its proper name, Aromatisse Big Basics. This is a deck that centralises around the use of Aromatisse and its ability to transfer fairy energy across your board. Now that in itself, when you look at something like a fairy deck, it's an amazing utility to have. It's a stage 1 and you can move all of this energy around. Oh, what's that? I've got a Genesect X here, it's got a load of damage on it. Let's move all the energy off, let's max potion it, let's get back up to full health, move the energy back, and continue as if nothing happened. It works amazingly well. There is no stipulation on Aromatisse's fairy transfer though, is there? As long as the energy attached to a Pokemon counts as a fairy energy, Aromatisse can move it. And this has led to the birth of Fairy Big Basics. Now, Big Basics, all through this format, was a good deck. It didn't headline as well as some other decks did. It wasn't always first place, but there were a lot, and I mean a lot of top cuts, featuring at least one or two Big Basic variants. The arrival of Aromatisse, combined with the fact that we now have Rainbow Energy and Prism Energy, means that Big Basics now gain the utility to freely move energy around the board. It makes them a lot more versatile than they were in the past. Meaning that Fairy Big Basics, or Aromatisse and Friends, or Aromatisse Big Basics, however you name it, has become less of a good deck and more of a great deck. It does have its own shortcomings and it can have its own weaknesses, with the fact that with most of your energy being special energies, you don't really seem to have much acceleration. Meaning that if your opponent turns around and says, I'm going to get all of this energy, I'm going to knock out something with 3 energy on it, that's another 3 turns of attachments you need to make up for. That being said though, the deck does have a lot of options, and that's what I'm going to cover today. I'm actually going to look at some of the options that Aromatisse and Friends can run. Now, I'm not going to cover every single option because we could pretty much be here all day. I'm just going to cover a good handful of Pokemon that I feel could go into this deck and seem to have a decent home here. So I'm going to start off strong with Genesect X. Now, Genesect itself, it's already seen a lot of success alongside Virizion. In a deck like this, Genesect is just given more survivability. Add to the fact that Genesect has a pretty potent punch and snipe attack, and you can see that you're already putting decent numbers onto the board. It's 100 to the active, that's 2-shotting pretty much anything. It's 20 to something on the bench. There's no resistance on the bench, so anything that resists grass doesn't matter. And even if it did, it's a case of, well, here's 20 on the bench, and I can slowly set up for future KOs. Much along the similar line as what Darkrai has done ever since day 1. Genesect isn't just good though because of its punch and snipe ability. It also carries its ability, Red Signal. If you attach a Plasma Energy from your hand onto Genesect, you basically get a free capture. So say last turn you went in, used my Glow Cannon, 100 to the active, 20 to the bench, and then your opponent decided, well, I don't want you knocking out my active Pokemon. I'm going to retreat it, I'm going to bring something else into the active position to start attacking or to act as a meat shield. Simply get a Plasma Energy, attach it to Genesect, bring out the last active, and proceed to KO. It's just that simple. It's basically what Genesect was built to do. It's why I believe Genesect Virizion has done so well. While we're talking about Plasma Energy, I want to move on to another one of this deck's other options. Namely, I want to actually talk about Lugia X. Now, Lugia itself is nowhere near as versatile as Genesect. Genesect, with manual attachments, you can start swinging turn 3, you can basically start setting up future KOs. Lugia, on the other hand, still relies on manual attachments. It's a 4-turn setup. It's not an early game attacker though. The reason I'm talking about Lugia X right now is the fact that, firstly, as I said, it ties in with Plasma Energy. It requires a Plasma Energy to attack. It's also your late game closer. After you've spent a lot of the game setting up with Genesect and a few of the other attackers I will be mentioning, you're going to have a lot of damage across your opponent's board. You're going to have quite a few options available to you. Lugia is here simply to turn around and say, I'm going to come in, I'm going to finish something off, it's most likely going to be an X, and you're going to take 3 prizes. Now, 3 prizes off 1 attack, I don't think anyone's ever going to say that's a bad idea. I'm not going to say focus the whole deck around running Lugia for that one ability. In my opinion, it's a case of you really should just run Lugia as a one-off tech. Put it in there, gives you the option to actually swing, take half your game in 1 attack. If you centralise the deck on it, you're going to focus too much on going for that one option, and your opponent might find a way of playing around it, or they'll just try and stop Lugia setting up. If they do that, then you're basically wasting turns. But Lugia itself, I feel, is a valid option for the deck. I'm not going to say it's the best option, I'm not saying it should be in every single list ever. But if you choose to run Lugia as a one-off, then it's going to do something at least once or twice. It could be the difference between going into time and tying, or actually winning a game. Just that one extra prize could make it for you. And as I said, Genesect and some of the other options for this deck do actually turn around and say, oh, hey, here's all this residual damage, here's some outfront active damage, let's actually set up for this game. So, as we continue through this episode, you will see that Lugia becomes a lot more viable. Moving on from Lugia, we now have Virizion X. Now, Virizion is in here just to actually take up the position that Slurpuff would do in something like Standard Fairy. If you're running a full Xerneas Aromatisse Fairy build, then one of the options available to you is Slurpuff, which effectively turns around and says anything with Fairy Energy attached is immune to status conditions. Now, we all know this is basically just Virizion's Verdant Wind. And Verdant Wind is very similar to Fairy Transfer. As long as the energy attached counts as a grass energy, you have the immunity. It doesn't have to be a basic energy to gain immunity from status conditions. I'm not gonna... Now, once again, this is a lot like what I'm saying with Lugia. You're not going to run like a full playset of this. You're not going to run 3 or 4 Virizion. It's going to be a one-off. It's a case of, do you fear Verbank and lasers? Yes? Okay, well, go for your Virizion, put it on the bench. Anything with energy on in this deck is most likely immune to status conditions now. So, Verbank Hypnotoxic doesn't do anything. If somebody's coming at you with a cheeky little Inkay, not going to do anything, is it? And I think that is basically the long and short of why Virizion is here. Virizion is just here to say, status conditions aren't a thing for my game. Turn 2 onwards, I don't have to worry about status conditions. Oh dear, what a terrible thing. Moving on from Virizion, we next have Darkrai X. Now, a few people would probably turn around and say, but Darkrai doesn't have much place in this deck. It is just a case of, oh well, Darkness Cloak, you don't really need it because you've got Fairy Garden. Oh well, you've got Night Spear. Well, Genesect's attack is pretty much identical to Night Spear. So why would you want to run Darkrai? Now, in my opinion, once again, this is just like Lugia and Virizion. it's most likely going to be your one-off tech. You may decide, if you see him putting in the work for you, you might want to run a second. But in my opinion, Darkrai is a searchable Fairy Garden. It's an alternate attacker for Genesect. If you've got a Genesect in the active position that's taken quite a bit of damage, wouldn't it be nice if you could just retreat that Genesect, go into Darkrai, move the energy across to Darkrai, and have him continue doing what Genesect was doing? I mean, I know that just sounds like, well, why don't you just carry on with Genesect? Sure, it's going to get knocked out, but oh well. Genesect has a function that Darkrai doesn't. Genesect has Red Signal. You might want that catcher later on. Now, sure, you're going to be running multiple Genesect, but why risk having to actually go into your deck, spend resources to get another Genesect when you've got one right there? Keep him alive. If you can keep that Genesect alive as long as possible, then you don't have to spend the resources to go for a second. And sure, your opponent, if your opponent's running their own Genesect, or they actually run catcher and hit heads, sure, they can bring out that Genesect, they can knock it out. Your opponent has spent the resources to do that. You've effectively turned around and said, okay, you've got rid of my Genesect. What do you do? You've spent resources doing that. I've not had to spend resources to try and keep him on the board. It's a case of, here's Darkrai in hand, he's on the board. At that point, you don't need Fairy Garden. If you have Fairy Garden, then go you. You've got double free retreat. But, you know, if you don't have the Fairy Garden on the field, you can still free retreat Genesect. You can still bring out that Darkrai. You can still carry on applying the same physical pressure. If your opponent goes for the Genesect, well, your energy is not on Genesect anymore, it's on Darkrai. So their primary target should be Darkrai, to get the energy off your board. If they don't, well, you're just going to keep on Night Spearing. 90 to the active, 30 to a bench. 90 to the active, 30 to a benched. And what does your opponent do to actually stop this? It's an offensive meat shield. It's a case of, oh well, I'm just sending this Darkrai out as a meat shield, it's just fodder. It's something to protect Genesect. It's still doing Genesect's job, it's still being offensive, it's still knocking things out, it's still setting up future KOs. The biggest thing I can really mention about it is just the whole fact that, in my opinion, it is a searchable Fairy Garden. It also can have the utility of being an alternate attacker to Genesect. Why risk Genesect when Darkrai can pretty much do the same job? Once again, I will turn around and say, yeah, it's most likely going to be a one-off. I'm not going to turn around and say, oh well, run like 2 or 3 Darkrai as well as Genesect. Because, yeah, Genesect does pretty much do the same job. You are most likely going to be running 3 Fairy Gardens, so you won't always need it for a free retreat. But there's going to be times when you just don't draw into Fairy Garden. Wouldn't it be nice to have a searchable one? There are times when you don't want to risk that Genesect. Wouldn't it be nice if you had something that had a similar attack that you didn't actually want to worry about losing because it doesn't have a built-in catcher? But that's just my thoughts on Darkrai. Next up, we're going to keep it with the Dark types for a moment, and we're going to look at Evotal X. Evotal X is here mostly for its Evil Ball. A lot like how when X's were first given to us, a lot of people turned around and said, here's Mewtwo, we're going to run it for X Ball because, you know, it's good damage. You can do the exact same with Evotal. In fact, Evotal has slightly better numbers than Mewtwo does, as well as better weaknesses and resistances. All the fact of the matter is, with Evotal in this deck, you do actually have the ability to actually just turn around and say, here's Evotal inactive. Let's heap a bunch of energy onto it. Let's deliver huge numbers. That's basically what Evotal does. It's another late game closer. It's a lot like Lugia, but it's a bit more stable, I want to say. most likely whatever is opposite you is going to be carrying about 3 energy. If you've already put damage on it, say you managed to hit it with 2 Night Spears or a couple of Megalo Cannons, so let's assume it's got, about 70 damage on it. Well, most X's have about 170 hit points, occasionally they'll have 180. Well, if they're carrying 3 energy, they're carrying 60 damage, effectively, on top of the original 70. So, they're providing 60, you need to provide 40, so 2 energy, and you're delivering 100. That's an Octane X. What's that, we got 180 hit points instead? Okay then, I'll just put on 1 additional energy. We'll go 3 for free, that's 120 between the two of us, 190 total, and I've just knocked out your X. It's a case of, even though you can heap a load of energy onto Evotal and just say, one shot, one shot, one shot, you really don't need to. Mostly because a lot of the things that are going to be sat opposite you are going to require 2 or 3 energy. Now, every energy your opponent's carrying is effectively 20 damage that they're carrying for themselves. Along with any setup that you've done beforehand, I've already mentioned the whole fact that we've got Genesect for sniping the bench, we've got Darkrai that can snipe the bench. I'm going to say right now, there are 2 more options I'm going to mention for this deck that can snipe the bench. So in total you've got 4 options for putting damage on the bench, and one of them's pretty damn cheap, so you will be able to actually set up cheap KOs. If you assume that anything your opponent puts in front of you is going to be carrying 3 energy, 2 energies for Evil Ball means you've guaranteed 100. 3 energies, it's 120 over both of you. So you've already got easy access to a lot of damage output, and it's effectively cheap damage output. It's not like it's turning around and saying, oh well, I need about 5 or 6 energies to start KOing things. With a bit of setup, if you actually try and set up for a medium length to long game, you effectively win out for much better economy in your late game. Now, for most of the options I've actually stated, Evotal is probably one of the few that actually turns around and says, yeah, you definitely want to run 2 of me, maybe 3, if you're really feeling like that kind of guy. And yeah, I'll be honest, that running a couple of Evotal is going to really work out for you. It's effectively your cheap attacker. It's decent damage in the early game, and it's finishing damage in the late game. There's no other way of really saying it. It's just a case of, here's Evotal, 2 energy. Well, I'm delivering 60 on my own. How much do you have on you? In fact, yeah, I've done most of my numbers wrong for this. Right, any numbers I've said before now on Evotal, add 20. So yeah, you can do 210 if you put a 3rd energy on. See, that's just how good Evotal is. I was assuming I was working with X ball numbers when it's Evil ball numbers. Best thing I can suggest is, Evotal, remember it's 20 plus 20 times, not just 20 times. Like I just did. Make sure you don't forget that. Like I just did. Didn't say I was. Like, I'm gonna be honest, I make plenty of mistakes with this, and I'll hold my hands up to them. I really will. But anyway, I've probably rambled about Evotal a bit there, so let's actually move on to something a bit more constructive. And the next thing I've got on my list is Lugia X. Now, as I said, a lot of things in this deck do bench damage, and Lugia X is basically the epitome of early game bench damage. For 1 fighting energy, he delivers 30 to the active, 30 to the bench. I already like these numbers. This, in my opinion, Lugia is your preferred turn 1 attacker. Everything in this deck tends to require 2 or 3 energies to start attacking. Landorus X. Do I have a fighting energy on me? Yes. Go, go. Punch the active, snipe the bench. Punch the active, snipe the bench. You can do this turn after turn. There's no limit on it. It's pretty amazing. And with Landorus in mind, we've already mentioned Darkrai does 30s to the bench. We mentioned Genesect does 20s to the bench. Now, I'll be honest, when I looked at Landorus X, this is where the penny really dropped for me. At first I thought it was a case of, oh well, you just have this multitude of attackers and they all do different things, so you keep your opponent on edge. Then I noticed that Landorus X fits in here beautifully. Being a turn 1, 30 to active and 30 to the bench was a case of, yeah, that's pretty good, that's your early game sorted out. And then I started noticing that every other potential attacker for this deck does bench damage. I've mentioned Landorus, 30-30. Genesect, 100 to the active, 20 to the bench. Darkrai, 90 to the active, 30 to the bench. The whole deck just turns around and says, set up for future KOs. And that's what it is. It's basically, you set up so many potential future prizes that eventually you hit a point where you can't set up anymore, you just have to start taking them. It's almost like the deck doesn't want to take the prizes, a case of just, I just want to put as many damage counters on the board as possible, and then eventually it gets to the point where it's like, oh well, I guess I'll have to take this prize. I guess I'll have to take this one. Oh, I wish I could put more damage on this board, but no, I have to take these prizes. And that is the true beauty of what this deck can do. And I'll be honest, yeah, the penny dropped because of Landorus X. His ability to use Hammerhead is a turn 1 attack, 30 to active, 30 to the bench. It's that simple. You probably never even have to look at Lounge Judgment, which is 2 fighting under the colours for 80 damage. Discard all fighting energy, you do 150 instead. I mean, right there in itself, Landorus himself sets up for future KOs, but most likely you will never look at Lounge Judgment, you'll just Hammerhead until Landorus is gone. And then you start using your other secondary bench hitting attacker. You'll start using Genesect, you'll start using Darkrai, you'll start picking up your prizes that way. But now I'm done gushing, let's bring this deck full circle. We started with Aromatisse and a nice little fairy, so let's end with a nice big fairy. And by that I mean Xerneas X. Now, once again, Xerneas X is another bench sniper. Xerneas X itself has the attack Breakthrough. For a fairy, double colourless, 60 to the active, 30 to the bench. And once again we find this deck just loves setting up future KOs. All of a sudden it's a case of, yeah, Lugia has a home in this deck. When you factor in Xerneas, Landorus, Genesect and Darkrai all doing bench damage, all of a sudden that one-off Lugia has a home. You can see how easily it can work as long as you get the energy on board. And to be honest, when I first actually started looking at potential Pokemon for this deck, yeah, Xerneas was one of the first options because it was alongside Aromatisse. But then I realised that everything else is doing bench damage. You're really going to be playing Xerneas for Breakthrough. You do have the option for X-Blast. If your opponent puts something in the active position that is potentially a big problem, then you can just go X-Blast, problem solved. Allow me to keep setting up for my end game when I can just steamroll you. And to be honest, yeah, I just think that when you factor in that pretty much every alternate option for this deck, does effectively turn around and say, we do bench damage, and Xerneas is another one that says bench damage is a thing. I'll be honest, I do look at these cards and think, yeah, this deck does set up well. Yes, you can run Lugia for that 3 prize turn. Yes, you can set up the steamroll. And effectively, yeah, that's what I see this deck being. You can keep things alive as long as possible. You can spread as much damage as quickly as possible. The biggest thing I can note about this deck is just the whole fact that from turn 3 onwards, it constantly applies pressure. If you can't shut this down after turn 3, then you're going to have a tough fight ahead of you. You are going to struggle against it. You have to have the answers. You have to be able to turn around and say, stop you doing what you're doing. Take your energy off the board. You do basically have to find a way to actually break this deck's flow somehow. And if you can't, yeah, as I said, you're going to have a tough time against it. That being said, there are ways around it. There is a whole fact that if your opponent can turn around and say, I'll knock out one of your key attackers, that's 3 energies off your board. And if your opponent can get 2 or 3 swift KOs in quick succession, and effectively take most of your energy off the board, then yes, you will most likely lose with this deck. That being said, your opponent has to set up for those swift KOs, and I can guarantee you this, it's a lot easier said than done. But that's just my opinion on Aromatisse and Friends. What do you guys think? As always, feel free to let me know down below in the comment section. And until next time, I've been Writer Joey. You guys are the top percent. Peace out.